Hello, my name is David Turner and this is another Lunar Poetry Short, and today I'm just off the Old Kent Road in South London and I'm joined by Amy Blakemore. And Amy's debut collection, Humbert Summer, was recently published by Eyewear, so I'm sure we'll hear some of that during the chat. Hello Amy.
Hello.
We'll start with a reading.
Okay. This is a pretty new poem I'm reading first, called Teeth Dreams, and it's sort of about pain and murderers. So, Teeth Dreams. 1. Relates to communication. What would it mean to you if I said mother at the kitchen table? Schopenhauer. Dentists are beginning to know you now. Teeth or autobiography, the orphan genre. A fixed address and useful hardware. It's morbid, but I stayed up late to read about the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer. How sad to be the one who is not reported missing. Resolved to filed records, a few unseated vertebrae, a drifter. Predictably had nightmares of a different serial killer, an injection of perplexity to the brain. I want you to describe the pain, like a hair is caught between the front two teeth or a filament of flame. Fig 1, you bite the hem of a wedding dress and they all come clean away. When you think about them, teeth are odd. These chromium exposed parts on, not of our bodies. But not as odd as your mouth would look without them, like a blood orange, split and dripping. I like to touch the sides of your face, a little below the ears, just after you have shaved. 2. In scripture. Your favourite saint is Simeon. It separates from out of him like fire or the calyx of a brilliant flower, a plain of flesh excised with messages, for through each sore souls like leaks. And 3 ribs were in its mouth, between its teeth, and thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. A wall, and 65 feet, stands between the world and thee. I forget you're a Catholic. Truly, badly, deeply. 3. Power. And I'd follow you through the mirror to a dreamscape made up of calorific pinks and corals, proper ayahuasca shit. Let me sit beside and touch your feet the whole trip. The stepped pyramid opens with a smile, and there we are by Dama's altar. The black vinyl shower curtain and dicks preserved in jars. And I'll tell you the story about the ladybird that bit my finger in the park. And the next poem I'm going to read is the title poem of my collection, Humbert Summer. Might as well. Humbert Summer. Subtly dirtied by 4-day drinking in a basement flat, I feel like bunting, a paisley tie and private wasp stings on a powder blue day. You're old. You won't get it. I want an epic landscape, sick of pushing syllables down the stairwell, hagiographic, on some middle-class Beasley Street. A colour retromaniac, I idolise violence and Duran Duran, but I don't want either to happen to me. My first world problems, intertextuality, shit MD, and the inevitable death of David Bowie.
Thank you very much, Amy. Hello.
Thank
How
you.
are you?
Bit hungover, but good.
I just want to say to start, teeth are really odd, aren't they? I'm glad you said that, because I can't, sometimes when I'm talking to people, I can't believe that we can talk about anything other than the fact we've got rows of exposed teeth in our,
It's actually,
in our faces. It's really odd.
That poem, starting from about a year ago, my boyfriend started having weird I think it's psychosomatic pain in his teeth. His teeth are perfect. He's been to every dentist going, so they've concluded it must be a psychological thing, but it doesn't seem to be good. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me talking about this. He tells everyone. So it's that poem is sort of about that, but I was quite fascinated by the idea of sort of psychosomatic toothache and how you explain that to people without sounding like a complete nutter.
Yeah. I suppose the amount of nerves you've got around that part of your body, I suppose it makes sense that if you're going to have psychosomatic pain anywhere.
Yeah, teeth.
I mean,
it's
there's such a link with
apparently
anxiety.
an unusual one.
Yeah.
To get kind of, psychosomatic.
I had 4 teeth removed recently. I've had this the late part of 2015 was just a toothy nightmare.
I started looking into kind of the significance of teeth as well, though, and what they mean in dreams. And there's all these different, having dreams about your teeth falling out or exploding, or is apparently a very common thing.
Exploding teeth.
Exploding teeth. I had one once,
yeah.
an exploding teeth dream, and there's all these different. It's a big thing in the Bible, and it denotes all sorts of different weird stuff. Apparently, having dreams about your teeth falling out or hurting. So there you
Crazy. I suppose we better talk about some poetry now.
go. Okay.
The first question is always, why poetry?
I think well, I started off trying to write prose, and I enjoyed it, but I don't think I was very good at it. And I suppose on a basic level, this sounds like super mundane. Poetry fits quite well around my life at the moment. I work full time and I do, various different jobs. So it's something that fits quite well around that, which makes it sound like I don't like poetry or but I suppose, if I had all day to write, perhaps I would experiment more with different forms and blah and prose. But as it is, poetry feels like something I can do justice to in the time I have available.
I think it's nice when poets talk about the realities of their life, because even for someone that's just had a collection come out, it doesn't mean that it changes your life at all, doesn't it? It doesn't give you any more, probably means you've got less time to actually write poetry, what with promoting and doing readings and stuff. And the reality for most poets is that the act of writing fits in around
completely. I'm lucky if I can find, I try and write at least a little bit most days, but the reality is I'm lucky if I can find maybe 10 solid hours a week in which I can actually write, which wouldn't really be compatible with, I don't know, epic verse or trying to get a spy novel out. But aside from that, I like the fact that you can do, particularly now, kind of, the boundaries have shifted, you can do kind of whatever you want with poetry. There are lots of people doing really experimental stuff.
Do you find because obviously there was quite dark elements, obvious elements to the first two things you read there, but do you find it easier to write about pain in shorter bursts like that? Yes,
I suppose if kind of, say the novelistic equivalent of the sort of poetry I write would be incredibly unremittingly dark and probably not have much of an audience. So in that sense, I think I'm very interested in shorter poetry, and that's something I'm working on at the moment, kind of a series or collection of really, really short poems, like 6 lines a pop, sort of thing. I'm interested in the kind of almost sort of monumental or monolithic quality of very short poems. I'll probably read some of those as we carry on. There's something about the form, particularly short poetry. I'm very interested in trying to sort of make something that small as perfect as possible, kind of like haiku or fragments of Sappho, or I think it's a James Baldwin quote, you just want to get that bone dry sentence. That's what I'm really interested in doing.
And so what have been your main influences as a writer?
I think I started out having like really, really kind of narrow horizons, and I still kind of do in some ways. I'm always finding new stuff, and that's really exciting to do. But I think in that sort of very depressed, anxious teenager way, it was probably the lyricism of bands like Suede and Placebo and Morrissey, obviously. But I was very interested in that kind of angst.
One of those kids, eh?
One of those kids, yeah, absolutely, teenage goth. So I suppose I kind of was a frustrated rock star because I never had the patience for learning an instrument and I can't sing. So writing songs became writing poems. And then I studied Ted Hughes at school, but obviously became more interested in Plath, as any sensible girl would. And then Emily Dickinson, the short poems thing, I think that comes from my slightly later teenager obsession with her. And now there are a lot of particularly female poets doing such amazing stuff. I love at the moment Anne Carson, Rebecca Perry, and yeah, like I'm interested in very experimental work, I guess. Yeah.
And on that note, perhaps we'll take another reading.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. I think I'll read you some more. These ones are a bit sillier, but very short. Introversion Forum. As if cut from the throat, in the cyan clarity of the moments that follow intercourse, we feel most keenly aware of the ice cream men and kites snapping taut against the wind. How far below? How many stories up are we? I kiss your eyelids. I saw it in a movie. Ah, bonsai. Like a calm torturer, laying out my bijou implements every day. I think my lover should be a little tree. And this is called My Pale Pink Bedspread, which is a real bedspread I actually own, and I wrote a poem about it. My pale pink bedspread is edged with glass beads, so that I feel like I have lined my chamber with the skins of the 1,000 high-status sateen ragdolls I have slain. I am a tiny, soft-lipped Khan, scratching my tongue with a flamingo bone. It almost makes me feel the smartly trousered knee of the hetero cray twin pressing hard between my breasts, and when I roll over in the night, it makes a sound like Duchess, Duchess, Duchess. And one more. This is called Our Town, and it's about where I live in Deptford. The dead rat was uninjured. Rigor mortis had set in, freezing the tail to a loop about the circumference of my forearm. Probably it had eaten poison. When it rains, which it sometimes does for days, the snails come out in liquid eye tiaras, and at night I saw a car with blue underlights parked outside the restaurant. Another place sells fruit loaves and second-hand bridesmaids' dresses. I don't know where to buy cat yet. Salvia, I do. Ask me about my tattoos. Red and white striped tube top, heart-shaped padlock. I didn't notice him putting his hand there, it was raining. But hold me like something that shakes when it goes unheld. You've trained your body not to take up the space it ought to take, and everyone else we've ever met would die if they came to this place.
Thank you very much. And no matter the theme, it's nice to have poetry about South East London on the podcast.
South East London.
As Lunar Poetry Podcast is very much a South East London
all the best
entity.
things are.
Yeah. Actually, all the best poetry is coming out of South East London at the moment, I think.
And
anyway.
the best grime.
Yeah. It's where it's at. Just that. No, I'm not even going to tell people how to get it because I don't want people
to come and ruin it.
Yeah. How important are open mic slots and public readings in the development of your writing?
It's interesting actually because I really like using, it's probably a slightly risky strategy, I really like using, I haven't been to an open mic in ages. I used to all the time when I was a teenager with a bunch of friends of mine who were also for young poets because that was the first prize I won. We'd go to the open mic at the Poetry Cafe like every Tuesday and stay out till like 2 a.m. But I really like using them now as a way of trying out new material because I don't tend to show people or really kind of workshop my poems. I just sort of work on them on my own and then debut them at readings. And it's quite a nice way, I find, of assessing people's reaction because you can't really hide whether or not you're enjoying a poem at a reading. You kind of find there's an energy between you and an audience. So in that sense, I read stuff and then afterwards, if it doesn't maybe quite get the reaction I hope for, I rework it or scrap it. And sometimes if you're not sure about something, you read it at reading and you get that kind of thoughtful and that's when you know, yeah, maybe this is all right.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, a lot of my stuff's changed dependent on audience reaction. There is obviously the reality though that you can't legislate for people not listening to you. Do you know what I mean? And yes. You can't always trust people to be listening. You know, and that's not really knocking people. You know, often you read at events where people have read before and people are just tired or have switched off for a second.
Yeah, and I do it at readings as well. Sometimes you just phase out.
But so I suppose I'm assuming it's just a part of how the editing process goes, and then so it's just about. Is it more about assessing what how the pace of a poem feels to you and the energy?
I think so, and also sometimes I find I'm reading something new, and it's never a good feeling when you're about to start the poem and you realise, crap, I'm a bit embarrassed by this poem, but I'm gonna read it. like that sort of feeling, which is something I only really get at readings when you think, am I gonna read it? I'm probably gonna read it. Probably means you shouldn't read it ever again.
Yeah. It's always a terrifying feeling when you're 2 lines in and you think, oh, this doesn't work at
No,
all.
no. And I think also because sometimes a lot of my poems deal with themes that, female sexuality or whatever, and sometimes I just think, I have a poem called 3 Abduction Fantasies, which is about abduction fantasies, and you just think some of my work is quite sort of problematic, or, I think if a guy had written these poems, people would maybe rightly not be very happy.
Yeah.
And I find readings are quite a good way of sort of testing out how far I feel like I can push things in that sense, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I mean, I've read, I had an experience early last year where I read a couple of poems where the content material could be misread or misinterpreted. And then in my head I thought, well, that's fine because I'll just explain in the introduction.
In your preamble.
But people don't listen to that. And then all of a sudden they've just got the free reign to misinterpret what you're reading. And then, so I've been very wary about, it can be, you'll be very careful with something. But, so I've only seen you read once in public, and that was at the Betsy Trotwood at Tim Wells's All Dayer recently.
It was good fun.
It was good fun, yeah. And it was my first one that I've ever attended completely sober.
Yeah.
So it was interesting.
Wow.
I actually remember all the poetry. From
Yeah,
the whole day,
I was wasted by the time
Yeah.
I came around to doing the best of British poetry reading.
You seem to be the kind of performer that likes to add a lot of energy or pace to certain poems. Not all your readings, but certain poems you tend to pick up the pace. How difficult is it for you to hand over the control over the pace of reading to people reading your book after you've been published?
Yeah, I think in some ways, I kind of hate the distinction and think it's a bit useless, but in some ways I consider myself more of a page than a performance poet. And I think that's just because I've seen so many great performers, like Kate Tempest at Latitude was performing the same year as me, and I was watching from backstage and it was just whoa. Like, she had completely 300 completely wasted guys just absolutely in the palm of her hand, staring up in awe at her, and I was among them. And I don't think I can be quite shy and coy, and I don't really think I can compare to performance poets who really hone their craft like that. But certain of my poems, an example is my poem about Valerie Solanas, which I read quite often, which I pick up the pace for. I just don't know in some ways if they work on the page quite as well as when I read them. But I don't mind kind of handing it. I'm always interested to see how people react to my stuff without the context of seeing me or hearing me read. I'm quite interested in sort of poetry removed from whatever sort of baggage or misconceptions can come with actually seeing or knowing who a poet is. I'm quite interested in that. So, whatever.
no, actually, I think I've maybe loaded that question a bit there, because I wasn't suggesting that it should be a difficult process to give over your work. It's just, I just think it's an interesting point to talk about, because it not only, I think a lot of people assume when you become published that the main fear would be people judging your work as to whether it's any good or not, but a big part of that is that whether you trust people to, and you're not in fact mistrusting the reader to understand your work. What you're doing is mistrusting yourself to write clearly enough to suggest to people. Would you agree with that?
I think having a book out, particularly because I'm probably pretty young for having a first collection, there were certain things people could misread, or I suppose like we were talking about earlier, some of it's not necessarily, it's not poems about larks or mountains. I was quite anxious about certain things being misread when I kind of wasn't there. I think, hearing me read a poem about 3 abduction fantasies and seeing me and knowing sort of what kind of person I am, or that, it's all a bit tongue-in-cheek, and reading it on the page, and not having that context for it could be a very different experience. And I think I was slightly worried about that. but I've been very lucky in that people who've kind of reviewed and responded to it so far have done so very thoughtfully and kindly. So I think there's a tendency sometimes in poetry to patronise the reader or audience. So I think I've tried not to do that, and
Actually, it's a very good point about not patronising people too much, because you and this is what I mean about it is patronising to suggest that you don't trust the reader, because people are not, most people are not idiots, and people will get things, and I think it seems often that what is claimed as mistrust for the reader is just a lack of confidence in the writer's own ability to get their point across.
I think also it's a slight offshoot of the fact that the audience for poetry is allegedly shrinking and blah blah blah. I think there's a tendency to kind of the audience for poetry is shrinking because people just don't get it anymore. People just don't understand my special little thoughts. And I actually think, well, perhaps there's a reason, and perhaps it's to do with poetry, and I've always wanted to write poetry for people who don't necessarily read poetry. Poetry with a sense of humour, and poetry that you can appreciate without having a master's. So that's something I'm quite conscious of. And for me, after a reading, one of the best things is when, someone's boyfriend has been dragged along, or, they've come with one of their mates and they're not really sure what to expect, and someone comes up to me after reading and says, I've never been to a reading before, I don't usually read poetry, but your stuff was great. Like, that's, for me, a lot nicer.
It's the only reason we started making these podcasts. That's the greatest praise I get is from people that have no interest in poetry, but have started listening regularly to the podcast because they feel like they have a connection to the writing and stuff. But I was just about to ask, how much of your writing then is an act of communication? Do you write first and foremost for yourself and hope people that like it, or do you actually write with a reader in mind?
I think that's changed actually since Humbert Summer came out. I'm now conscious of the fact I'm kind of writing with, God, this sounds so presumptuous, but like kind of a next book in mind, which I don't think I was before. Like, I might be wrong here, but I think most poets just start out kind of, throw some shit at the wall, see if any of it sticks. And once it starts to, I think it does change how you write, and it changes what you write. I'm maybe not sure exactly how, but I think that's something I'm conscious of happening in my own writing. I suppose I'm more kind of consciously experimental. I think it's become more of an act of communication. Probably, like in the last year.
I suppose that's a natural progression, isn't it? If you start writing, it would be odd if the first thing you ever wrote was for an audience. It seems much more natural you would write for yourself, but then with more exposure, then especially if you're doing public readings, it's sort of impossible to not notice what the connection is with people. Yeah,
I think it's interesting because the main times poetry, I know this is such a sort of trite thing to say, but the main times poetry enters into people's lives at things like weddings and funerals and blah blah blah. So I think it's perhaps one of the problems with the way poetry is taught and the way people begin writing poetry is that they start writing as an act of kind of communication, sort of speechifying ideas about what poetry is, rather than viewing it first and foremost as quite an intimate thing. I kind of think about it more like sort of pillow talk.
Actually, it's a really good point. I don't know why I can't think of what the context is, but you're the second voice that I've heard this week mention about the place of poetry within funerals and weddings.
Yeah.
And it takes poetry, which is often not written at a time of importance.
Yeah.
Like most people after school only come across poetry in these really sort of very emotional events. And you sort of then, what happens is that poetry doesn't exist in the everyday, does it?
No.
It only exists at these very extremes of someone coming into the world or leaving the world, or this
or in adverts now.
Or
but very, very pompous ones. Yeah.
But perhaps on that note of poetry being read publicly, we should have our final reading.
Okay. since I mentioned it earlier, I will read Valerie Solanas. Dear listener, you may know who she is. She shot Andy Warhol. Didn't kill him, obviously. And was the writer of the Scum Manifesto, which is brilliant. Valerie Solanas. Discretion is the better part of not an actress insult writer for a diamond characteristic 32 automatic that on the day she wore makeup. Billy says the whole the sorry show made Andy unlovable, unlovely as a slice of peanut brittle, spunk snack, hack up the walls in hotels, Chelsea, Bristol, Bellevue, these traditional structures of Leonard Cohen songs about fellatio, satin sheets in the bourgeois theatre, like last day's all mnemonic, matic misery. Her mother burned her belongings posthumously. And for my last poem, I'm going to read a poem called Patterns, if I can find it, which I'm sure I will eventually, which is a breakup poem. Lol. Patterns. 1. Every morning and without screaming, in yellow habit, birds wit and champion the guiltless waking, threaded on temperate radar and the drear wing of summer rain. Do you remember the dream of going back to Blue Eyes? Beautiful, he's the best fuck in the business. This is why I'm not allowed nice things, and more's the pity, the body of a boy like a country will not commit to memory, further than the smell of city, a soft grey t-shirt and well-formed mouth. Of course, these were the always, the parts that killed and touched you most. 2. Buy the milk, make the bed, knowing where to find and how best hurt each other. It's what grown-ups do. It's how your parents met. Forget the cemetery and all the red beatitude of sun cracking the ice in his heart as if on floating panes of lead. It was joy, but never unalloyed, sending nudes in tiny games and variations of bloody murder. Just the same, these feelings feed on death, and as much as death means, the reordering of personality, the correction of what seemed effective anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. It's always a really good sign when I wish I hadn't set an arbitrary time for these short podcasts of around a half an hour, because we've come to the end of our time. But it's been really nice. I'm sure we'll have the chance to talk again on perhaps a more specific subject. I'd like that very much. Finally, where can people check out your work, blogs or?
Yes, I have a Twitter at AK Blakemore. I don't really have a website at the moment, I'm afraid, but I tend to post when stuff goes up online on my Twitter, so that's probably a good place to start. My book is available from the website of my publisher Eyewear, and also on Amazon, but don't buy it there. And in the London Review of Books bookshop in central London, and Foyles and Large Waterstones. So there you go. Please do buy it. I'm very poor.
yeah. Buy some poetry, for Christ's sake, instead of downloading it. Listen to it for free from me.
No, don't
listen to it. This is just an introduction to buying books. Also, you've had some work on Tom Bland's Blue of Noon
blog.
Yeah.
I believe so.
Yeah, so have I. A few of my guests recently have. Check out Tom Bland's.
Tom Bland.
I don't like to promote Tom Bland too much.
He doesn't need it.
He doesn't need. He's very good at self-promotion. But check out Blue of Noon, because there's some interesting stuff on there, and all the links to all these blogs, and that will be in the description of the video. Thank you, Amy, so much.
Thank you very much.
And goodbye from South East London.
Goodbye.